And thank you everyone for being here. I mean, I know there's a lot going on, unprecedented times right now that we're living in, and I feel like I was just saying a little bit ago that having opportunities like this, or making time for opportunities like this to come together in conversation, and to think about how we can depolarize our society, especially as we all kind of retreat to kind of the shelter in place mode. I mean, the idea that we're maybe more distant in physical space, but that could actually be a call to coming together in digital space. So thank you for joining the conversation. And yeah, please feel free at any point. If you have a comment, there's the chat box. I'm looking at some of the comments right now. It's nice to see people coming in from different backgrounds with different interests, from conflict resolution, restorative justice, to it's kind of interfaith chaplaincy, ecological justice, social work, horticultural therapy, food and placemaking, intersections of religion and politics, and bringing in the, Danielle, you were mentioning that the questions around disability rights, and Xiying thinking about school bullying and sex education. So one thing to just think about as we go forward in this conversation is I'll be sharing some ideas, and we'll be kind of looking at a document together that's going to raise some questions. Ultimately, I definitely want to leave time at the end to think about how what we talk about really connects to our own context, our own thoughts about education and the world more broadly. So thank you for sharing about where you're coming from, both in space and interests. And at this point, I'm going to try to share my screen, and hopefully, it says it's loading. Okay, it's not actually showing up on my end. Oh. I'm having some tech issues on my end being able to hear. Can someone give me a thumbs up? Can you see my screen right now?
Yep, we can see it.
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, awesome.
When you tried to put it into presentation mode, when I think we saw loading like you did.
Yeah, okay, and it wasn't loading for some reason. So I might just keep it here for now. I'll try, I can try one more time just to see if it does show up. Oh, it did it. All right, technology coming through. Okay, so just to give a bit of an overview of what the sequence will be, we'll start with introductions and then kind of get into conversation around norms and some of the values we bring to a conversation like the one we're going to have. And then we're going to get into a case study analysis in small groups. I think we'll do groups of 3. And I'll probably, if I can figure out the technology jump around, I'm not the most familiar with Zoom. This is me in a learning process too. So in small groups, the case study is going to be something that brings a dilemma to the group, and a dilemma being a situation that raises some really deep ethical questions and doesn't really have a clear right answer or an obvious way forward. So it's really going to open discussion, hopefully, and we can think about what the different values are and what the different ideas in the case bring out in our own analysis, and how we understand the different stakeholders in the case, how they might see things differently. So that's going to be something we'll do in small groups, and then we'll debrief in a larger group, which it looks like be a group of 6 and maybe 7, and others might join as we go. And then I'm going to just present a few ideas that for me, kind of lie at the heart of these ideas of pluralism and depolarization in society, and relating them to the case, and then relating them really to education more broadly. What I'd be really excited for, and this is something that I feel like can go in different directions following that brief presentation, is the feedback and discussion. And leading into that, if there are some questions, clarifying questions or probing questions people are interested in understanding or getting clarity around anything that I share, that'd be great. And then we'll kind of open it up to just see how people make those connections to specific contexts, or reflect on the ideas in different ways. So any questions as we start out in terms of the sequence? Oh, one thing that's really helpful, if you want to unmute, you can always just press the space bar. You can also unmute and then it stays on mute. But if you want to just do it temporarily, you can just press space bar and that'll unmute temporarily. All right. So the introductions, this is something that we'll do in groups of 3, and it'll probably take about 10 minutes. And we'll introduce ourselves, basically just saying who you are, and then really if you could share about an experience of connecting across divides. And the way I would actually think about what that sort of connection could be is if you're ever in a space where you're really connecting with someone who you might have seen as other in some sense of the term, or you've been socialized to see as other or different from you, and then you have this experience of really connecting and kind of breaking out of an echo chamber, so to speak. So so we'll do that in groups of 3. I'm gonna try to set up the breakout rooms right now, and once you see that breakout room option, you can click on it. It should give you about a minute of warning when we're kind of coming back together. So it's about like 3 minutes each if you try to think about making sure to share the time. And breakout rooms. Okay. It's not giving me the option right now though it was here before. Let me see. Okay. Breakout rooms. 3 per room. Okay. And okay, so any questions before we go into those rooms about what you'll be sharing or talking about? All right, awesome. So I'm going to open all the rooms. It should be, you'll see a link once they're open that you can just click on. Hi, Melissa. Hi, Melissa, welcome. Feel free to unmute. We are just coming back from breakout rooms right now. Okay, so it looks like we're back, and we're just joined by Melissa. Melissa, if you notice in the chat, I'm David, and we were just sharing a little bit about our backgrounds and connecting across differences, that experience of connecting across differences that we've had. And I posted in the chat if you'd like to share where you're zooming in from, and anything about your interests or what you're working on these days, inside or outside the world of education, that'd be great. I think we're all back. So one question that I feel like will lead into the larger conversation about the case that we'll be looking at is to think about any of the mindsets actually, I'm going to try to show my screen again. I'm sorry, I'm trying to share screen. There it is. Okay. Okay, yes, here we are. So in the chat box, if you're able to just share any insight, if you're thinking back on those experiences of connecting across differences, whether it was in like a really organized setting where you're having a structured conversation in a workshop, or doing something with an organization, or it's an experience that's kind of more open, that you're just immersed in another context, or in any variety of ways, breaking out of an echo chamber that you had been in. If you think back on those experiences, if you're able to put into the chat some insight into what enabled that connection, that sense of connection to happen. And that could be a mindset that you had or others had in the dynamics. It could be something about those interpersonal dynamics. Especially in more structured settings, there could be some stated or unstated guidelines for communication. So just to take a minute and reflect, I'll give some time to think about that. And you can share one or two things that really stood out in terms of what were the conditions that enabled connection to happen across differences. Any questions on the prompt? Okay.
Do you want us to send those responses?
Yeah, if you're able to put them into the chat box, take a minute to think, and then if you're able to share something in the chat, that'd be great. And then we'll talk once you'll have a chance to think about it, maybe write something. Melissa, if you're on the call in the Zoom, then to give you the context that other people are thinking about right now, people were just introducing themselves and sharing about an experience that they've had. And so if you think back to any experiences you've had connecting across differences and something stands out in your mind about what enabled that to happen, that'd be great for you to jump right into the chat too. And feel free to share where you're zooming in from as well. Okay, and I'm seeing a few responses coming in, so feel free to keep typing if you're typing, which is to highlight those to people. One idea that stands out from Yael is that it's possible to kind of affirm that the conversation is happening, and at the same time, making it clear that that affirmation of the conversation doesn't also imply affirmation in the sense of agreement with what's being said. Sometimes it's helpful to not make things explicit, and sometimes it is important to be explicit. So having that kind of mindful awareness of when being explicit or not, or going into some of those that maybe going into that territory explicitly could be constructive or not. And then Danielle sharing this mindset can make employees feel that they won't be able to get better and resume their normal pre-disability life. Okay. And then from Thomas, this idea that there's a mutual agreement that there's it sounds like, and please jump in if I ever mischaracterize what you're saying, but it sounds like if there's a dynamic that everybody wants to change for the better, recognizing that the discourse is at a low point, then that commitment to mutual understanding, which it seems like could be really distinguished from trying to convince or resolve, but really seeking to understand where people were coming from and why they felt what they were feeling, was a way to bring people into a better sense of connection. And then from Anna, what stands out? Yeah, focusing on not reducing people to a caricature of their political views to attack. Yeah, and giving that sort of sense, if you're going to meet somebody, if you have that perspective on who they are or what they'll bring to the table. And having that sense of, if there's someone you trust who kind of sets that tone and lets you know that they won't take that sort of approach that might be a more personal attack or a reductionist view of who you are, or make a character or ridicule your views. And then from Xi Ying, the idea of sharing the same interests in terms of being able to connect. Sometimes it's really, it might not even be about a very controversial issue to start. Sometimes the idea that connection doesn't jump right into what divides us, but can be focused around shared interest. And then jumping back to Alita's comment earlier, sorry, I was going through the chat box and then caught back up. Kind of the open mind for understanding a new culture. So that idea of reserving judgment and seeking to understand what other people are thinking without getting angry, kind of at a lack of moral character, or judging moral center right off the bat. So yeah, thank you. This is, I feel like all of these ideas really are powerful and can in many ways apply in so many different contexts. And as a teacher, just to share a little bit about my background, I was teaching 8th grade social studies for 7 years. And I always found it really important to really say, if we're going to get into some complex territory, if we're going to get into some controversial issues, how can we do it well? What does it take to really engage in these conversations well? And it doesn't mean that when those ideas come out that, okay, now we're done, now we know how to do it well, now we're going to do it. I feel like I even share from my own fallibility and kind of make myself vulnerable in the sense that, yeah, I've messed up as a teacher, and I know that I will. So part of it is kind of a constant conversation and returning to those sorts of questions. Are we bringing these ideas into our space together? How are we going to approach issues that arise? Considering that we're only here for an hour and a half together, we're not going to get into all those conversations, really kind of put together a collaborative sense of this is what we're really committing to. And instead, I think it will resonate in a lot of ways. These are some ideas that I I pulled from a few different sources. I cited one at the bottom. It's courageous conversations about race. And I feel like these could be courageous conversations, period. With some tweaks, and I borrowed from a couple other places too, including like a couple from like Meeting Wise. But the top one, stay engaged and respect the dignity of the people around the virtual table. In this case, of the virtual table, it could be around the physical table too. And I think that really ties into the idea of not judging, like Alita, you were saying, or not reducing people and or making assumptions that, of their moral character, and really seeking to understand and listening. And a lot of the comments that I was just reading, that I think really came through in different ways. This one, speak your truth and practice inquiry. The speak your truth is kind of the idea that it's not about speaking for a whole group, but to really just speak from your experience and from what you know, so you don't feel the pressure, or people don't see themselves as saying, I speak for everybody of a particular identity. Though referencing aspects of your identity for sure can be really important. And that idea of practicing inquiry. So while we're speaking our truth, we're also seeking to understand the ideas and perspectives of people around the table. And then there's share the airtime, which I feel like can take two forms for people who are very inclined to jump in and share ideas, to really consciously make sure that other people have the space to jump in, especially being aware that sometimes people sit in with the silence before stepping in. So oftentimes thinking about, did everyone have a chance to speak? Can we see if somebody wants to jump in? And someone can always say they want to pass, so there's not like a pressure to, but to make sure that people feel like there's a shared responsibility for making sure everyone gets the chance to contribute. And these last ones, expect and accept non-closure, especially getting into a dilemma, like I mentioned before, and I'll talk about it again in a second, the idea that there isn't a single right answer. And it would be very strange, actually, if we all came out completely on the same page about what the answer is, or if we all came out in complete agreement. So kind of expecting that and accepting that, and the idea is not that we will come out with a sense of consensus, but that we actually will likely not. And I think kind of in keeping with that, and tying back to a few of the others in the comments before, listening with resilience. In the courageous conversations about race, it was experienced discomfort. And for me, this idea of listening with resilience, I mean, sometimes things will go to a place that, okay, I can't like bring my kind of listening and inquiry mindset to the conversation. And that's, I think, really important to be mindful of. But the idea of listening with resilience, sometimes conversations are hard and go to places that are challenging. And that oftentimes is a path forward, is to really listen with resilience and seek to understand where people are coming from and why. So bringing those kind of norms into the conversation going forward. First, is anyone who feels like really strongly about any one of these, that they said, no, this is not something that I'd want to bring to a conversation for any reason? Okay. And I know this is not a comprehensive list, but just to kind of, given the time that we have, set some of the norms that we'll kind of bring to the table, and maybe just a quick visual of a thumbs up if we're kind of okay with this. And I'll see if I can see people. Okay. All right. So, so going forward.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go for it. Go for it. Oh, you're on mute. I can't hear you right now.
Sorry, my bad.
Okay.
Just to be clear, you're setting up norms for the conversation that we're about to have, and or presenting like when we approach courageous conversations more generally.
Great point. Thank you for raising that question. Is that, so if I'm understanding you, you're saying, is this going to be what we bring to the conversation we have with each other? Or is this kind of like a presentation of something that we can learn about and do in the future? Is that your question?
Yeah, and I mean, and I think it could be both, but just like, when you said like thumbs up, like, are we agreeing to this is how we'll approach this for the next hour or however long, or yeah.
Yeah, so this is, I would say, very much about the next hour. And I'd recommend, like, yeah, thinking about these and making them relevant. I also want to just speak to what I just saw Alita put into the chat. And again, this isn't a comprehensive list of, yeah, hearing other people's views. It says stories stay, learning grows. One thing I do want to just acknowledge is that it's a recorded conversation. So for purposes of sharing, and I know that it does and can impact sharing and the way we engage. Just to be mindful of that. I think there are definitely contexts, there are definitely spaces, kind of, Yael, speaking to your point, that if we're thinking about these in a broader context, where that idea of the stories stay, the individual sharing, the personal experiences stay, while we don't want to say, okay, and all the learning that we have from these conversations needs to stay also. No, we want that to go out into the world. But in this case, to be mindful of the fact that it is a recorded session. So it's kind of just something that we're working with in this space. Thomas, anything you would want to add to that?
No, I think you covered everything.
Okay. Great. So going from there, I mentioned this before, but the idea of a dilemma, because we're about to get into one in those same breakout groups, the idea of a dilemma is really just this idea that we're going to look at a case, a scenario, something that actually happened. It's actually in Sharon, Massachusetts. So true story. And it's a story that involves a kind of decision point that doesn't have a clear answer. And it raises ethical questions, it brings in different values. And you can really look at this decision point from many different perspectives through different lenses to try to understand what's at stake and what you think might be the best way forward, or what the different options for the way forward might be. So it's about a page and a half that kind of explains the case. And what you see on the screen right now are 4 questions that also appear in the document. So I'll tell you in a second how to get to the document. But these four questions you might not get to, because we'll probably take about 15 minutes in the breakout groups, and some of that time will have to be spent reading. So if you really get to the first one in those breakout groups, just to think about what is the dilemma, like what makes this a dilemma, what's in conflict here in terms of values, is kind of going into question number 2. So if you kind of get into those sorts of questions, even if you don't get to questions 3 and 4, that's perfectly fine. And we're going to come back together as a whole group and kind of debrief some of our takeaways and think through what the implications could be. So are there any questions about these questions, about what we're going to do? Okay, and this is where I'm going to go back to the technology and figuring out the breakout groups. We'll stay in the same breakout groups. Melissa, are you able to unmute for a second? I just wanted to touch base, because I tried to put you in a breakout group before, but I'm not sure it worked just when you joined before. Melissa, are you there?
There, did that do it?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, is it possible that I can just keep listening?
Yeah, the one thing is that we're going to be in breakout groups. So if you're going to be listening to a conversation, then you will be in one of those groups. And I'd invite you to share any thoughts on your mind, because you'll just be with a group of 3 people essentially having a conversation. But yeah, it's your call what you choose to share or not. So does that work for you?
Sure, fair enough. And you'll tell me how to get in a breakout group. Technology.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you say that one more time?
Oh, and you will direct me on how to get to a breakout group.
Yes. I'm sorry, it just cut out for a second, but yeah, I'll put you in one of the breakout groups.
Got it.
Okay. Great. So let me figure out. breakout rooms, and open all rooms. So you all should see an invitation now to those same rooms. Great. And Melissa, I'm going to now assign you to breakout room number 1. Melissa, do you see that showing up, an invitation to a breakout room?
I do, yes.
Okay, so you can join. I'll be jumping in and out of those rooms. So once you're in there, you'll just be in a conversation. Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah.
Thank you, David, so much. I really appreciate what you're telling me. Thank you so much.
No problem. Are you going to continue, or are you, are you going to be in the breakout room?
No, I just had to send in Thomas an email, so I'm interested in talking about disability rights. So.
Okay, so that'll be a separate time. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for joining.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, you are.
Thank you.
Fernando, and please correct me, but Kishore. Can you hear me? And feel free to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. And how do you pronounce your name?
It's actually not Kishore, it's Sanjay.
Sanjay.
Kishore is my second name, don't worry.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for being here. And Fernando, can you hear me as well? Hello? Oh, Fernando, I think, is on mute still. Okay, well, Fernando, if you're able to unmute or send something in the chat just to let me know if you can hear me, I'm going to just share a little bit about what's going on, because there's only about less than half an hour left. But it's great to have you here, and I can catch you up, and then you can join the conversation. So we start off just with introductions. People shared where they're kind of zooming in from. Where are you zooming in from right now, Sanjay?
I'm zooming in from Bogota, Colombia.
Oh, cool.
Yes.
Nice. That's actually where I started. I started teaching. I was in Santander, in
Okay.
in a small town called Charala, but
Charala.
near San Gil. But
Yes.
I spent some time in Bogota too.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, it's a great.
Are
time.
you in Cambridge?
Yeah, right outside Cambridge.
Okay.
And Fernando, if you're able to hear me, it'd be great to know where you're zooming in from.
Hi.
Hey.
Just 1 second. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Where are you zooming in from?
I'm speaking from Brazil.
From
Southern
Brazil.
Brazil.
Awesome. So there actually isn't a ton of time left, but to give you a sense of what's going on, we did talk about some values that we're bringing to a conversation, and people are right now in breakout rooms having a conversation about an ethical dilemma. The goal of this conversation is to really think about pluralism. What is this idea of pluralism, and how does it connect to education and depolarization of societies? The dilemma is basically a situation, it's a true situation that happened in the Boston area that leads to a decision that doesn't have an easy answer, an obvious choice, and raises some ethical questions and puts values in conflict with one another. So in going into the conversation, we just set some kind of values of really seeking to understand and not necessarily coming to a place of complete agreement, and definitely respecting the different people around the table, engaging with their ideas, and that's not engaging in any kind of attacks on who they are for what they're saying. So does that make sense so far in terms of what I just shared?
Yes.
Yeah, right. So just, okay, sorry.
Oh, no, go for it.
Just let me understand, what time did you start this?
We started at 1 Eastern Daylight Time. So
Okay.
it only goes till 2:30 this time. So there's only about 20 minutes
I
left.
thought you have, okay, I see. I thought you guys have just started. So
okay.
it's
That's okay.
a misunderstanding in the time zone.
Yeah,
I was
time
confused
zone
as well.
Okay. So would you like to get the case and think about it? I mean, if it's for the last part of the conversation, it's up to you. I understand.
No, but I will make sure that the next meeting I will be there on time.
Okay, not a problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah.
Okay.
Could you please send us the recording, perhaps, David?
For sure. I would need to know your contact
Yeah.
info. I don't know if that shows up automatically. So,
My email?
if you'd like to give me an email or something, I could follow up with you.
Absolutely, yes. I'm writing it on the chat. Uniandes.
Okay.
Lovely.
Okay.
And my name is Sanjay.
Okay. Got it. And
Okay,
Fernando, would you like the name, or would you like to?
No, I'll also do something else then. I'd like to check the first part of the conversation.
Okay, so did you share your email as well?
Yes.
Oh yeah, I got both of your emails. Okay, great. I will follow up with both of you with the recording.
Thanks. Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Alita?
Like if you, wow.
Hello? Oh. Okay. We are back. And Alita, are you back with us?
It looks like what it's showing is that she doesn't have, maybe she's connecting to audio.
Yes,
Okay.
her
She might
internet
have just been
slow
Other
in
people
her
figured it
small
out.
group.
And a couple other people joined because they were confused about time zones while people were in breakout rooms, but they decided that they would just like to have the recording sent their way. So we can follow up. They send their email. That's what's in the chat box right now. And let me see. Okay, it looks like Alita might not be in. Maybe she'll try to get back in. I'll have to keep an eye out for that. Trying to get back in now. Okay. So the questions kind of coming together. Just and I know there were more questions than you can cover in those in that amount of time. But just to hear from different people to start out, like how did you understand the dilemma in the case? And we have a small group, so I think people can just chime in. Feel free to unmute yourself either by pressing the space bar or by just hitting unmute, and we'll have a conversation.
Yeah. Oh, Alita, you're back. Wonderful.
Yes.
So for our group, I think we kind of we're really kind of caught up in two pieces of the case study. Thinking about,
now I can hear you.
Wonderful. Okay. We were caught up in two pieces of the case study, kind of thinking about who are the actual stakeholders in this, because I think that the framing we initially read was like it's about the students and the youth who are part of this, but then as we kind of stepped back, and I think it was Melissa's comment that kind of like brought this out, was maybe the youth actually aren't the stakeholders at all, and like it's mostly about the adults who are convening this. So the folks who are in the synagogue, the folks who are in the mosque, like this is a project of adults to make this kind of happen. And I think from there, we kind of then thought about then what value is actually at stake here, what things who then is supposed to take on the work? Should it be focused on youth, or this is more, should it be the adults should pause and look what they're actually trying to accomplish here? Separate from the youth, the comparison I kind of made to it was looking at the ways in which integration happened in the US. We asked students to do it rather than asking the adults to integrate society themselves. And so that kind of, to me, that comparison is really helpful to understand what was going on here, and that I think that this wasn't a project for the youth at all. It was really about the adults in the room, and that they were trying to figure out a way to accomplish their goal, and they chose their youth to do that without really understanding the ways in which they would be impacted with what they couldn't necessarily foresee happening at the beginning. I hope that makes some sense out loud.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Like, and that comparison is fascinating. Thinking about what the role of the adults are and what the role of the youth and the kind of theory of change behind that for society. Really interesting connection.
Yeah, and I think from that we kind of thought about, well, then who does it make sense to have at the table when trying to deal with this dilemma? Like at this point, it's been a youth planning committee or whatever, but the case makes it pretty clear that there are like adults who have a stake in this. So then who is the decision-making body now? And like that alone would affect, like, I would imagine that if the decision-making body was like the youth and the rabbi at the synagogue alone, if they chose whatever they chose, the people at the table who were included versus excluded would also have an effect on the event itself and how it was perceived.
Mm-hmm. How about from the other group? Any thoughts on how to frame what the dilemma is and what might be at stake?
I had originally identified the dilemma as the impact of the sign's presence, and like the different ways that the sign would impact. And then as we talked more about it, I started to feel like, I mean, the core of this moment is also the core of much of the conflict around this topic more broadly. And that's like relationship to Israel. What does the word Israel represent? And yeah, when there's so many differing and valid, well, it's not even my place to assign validity to opinions, but there's so many differing relationships to what Israel means. Yeah, it would be really, I think it's challenging for this event to, it feels like there's like a sense of urgency, or maybe there's not time to really have the proper discussion that includes all the stakeholders. And I think, correct me group members if I'm off here, but we sort of were concluding that the sign should come down for this event, but then maybe it could lead to like larger discussion with stakeholders later or afterwards. But this is like a small thing that's related to a lot of like triggering topics for people based on their personal experience. And so if you start like pulling at the thread of this sign, it's gonna connect like to people's bodies in really intense ways. So just like acknowledging all that.
Thank you. I want to be a little bit cognizant of time. And Thomas, I know it's called for 1 to 2:30. If that's a hard stop, then I might just segue, even though we're not getting even close into like the full discussion of the case itself. If there's kind of more leeway and people are up for it, I'm happy to let things go further. Thomas, what's your take on that?
I mean, it's a small enough group. I think if folks want us to go on a bit longer, feel free. But I probably wouldn't go past maybe 5 or 10 extra minutes, I think.
Okay. All right. So I might just segue because I feel like there is so much richness to this discussion that we could get into, and I feel like it highlights a certain type of education that I think is enough to raise the questions that I'm really interested in exploring and applying to our different contexts. So I do apologize. I mean, I feel like there's so much more that we could get into here. But to segue actually from, Anna, what you were just sharing about the kind of ambiguity, what does Israel mean? Who's the we? What does support mean? I mean, there's a lot of questions that I think could be raised about what is this sign actually saying, and then the question of urgency and how do you maybe kind of think about this conversation in more long-term ways. Who needs to be at the table, and how do you address the issues in the future? So a lot to think about there. I am going to just share my screen right now because the questions that I'm going to raise aren't actually specific to this case or in any way specific to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but are much more about education more broadly. So let me go back to and hopefully this will work. So really building off of Anna, what you just shared, that because it is really ambiguous, what does it mean to say we support Israel? One thing that I think about in terms of pluralism is when you're trying to build a coalition, when you're trying to say, hey, let's bring people into space together from across differences. Ambiguity in a statement like that is very powerful. And it can raise questions about who is possibly feeling that they would be united behind a sign like that. And in uniting everyone behind that sign who would feel affirmed by that sign, who might you be inherently alienating? So to use that sign as an example, but again, this is, I think, a concept that I'm taking away and I'd be really interested in your feedback on more broadly, is that in a sign that says we support Israel, on that particular issue, someone could come into that coalition that feels that sense of unity behind that sign, who has a very dehumanizing view towards Palestinians, right? It doesn't say anything about the respect for kind of dignity of people more broadly. It doesn't say anything about any kind of commitment beyond a commitment to that idea of Israel. Like, and as Anna, you pointed out, that is kind of vague. So on the one hand, I feel like one thing that could be raised is the idea that, you know, this is about bringing people together to share in a celebration. This isn't actually about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So let's not bring that issue to the fore. And I guess what I'm taking away, in addition to possibly that line of questioning, is this idea that that sign itself can unify people who might dehumanize the other. And in the context of pluralism, this is the question that I feel like I'd want to explore with students. What would it mean to use language that actually opens the door to a coalition across divides based on certain common values? And how do you build, and that's kind of the sense of the term of pluralism that I'm using. And to highlight the point that if someone feels like they could be joining the coalition and has a hateful view towards the other, there is no way that that other, whichever side is of a false dichotomy is doing that, could also join the coalition, because they can't stand shoulder to shoulder with someone who sees them in dehumanizing terms. So that's one question that I had that really came from this case study, was about how do you build coalitions across divides? And more broadly, it's a question, and I think this goes into the second point here on the screen, which is that the role of educational institutions and curricula, the idea that I'm arguing for is that they should be designed to explicitly affirm pluralism. And that doesn't happen by saying we're just going to be neutral and set aside these hot topics and avoid difficult questions, or create a kind of supposedly neutral environment that actually does convey certain cultural values or certain the supremacy of certain dominant cultures, right, in any context. But to say, what does it mean to affirm pluralism, and in particular, in the context of a liberal democracy, affirm that kind of commitment to human dignity and epistemological humility? What I mean by epistemological humility is that there isn't one single view of the world that should be imposed on everybody because it's the only right way to be. I feel like with those two combined, there's an understanding of what pluralism can mean. Like, you need to have a commitment to human dignity, because otherwise you might say, sure, I have this humility, but some groups don't even count as worthy of ethical consideration. And you need the epistemological humility, because otherwise you might see somebody as having human dignity, but being misguided because you have the complete view of how the world should be and how people should behave. So you feel like you can then impose that view on others. So what this looks like is a question that I have. And in the last few minutes today, because it's completely coming down to the last few minutes, I'd be interested if you have clarifying questions. I'm happy to answer in any way that I can, or just sit with the questions. And then leaving it to you to decide, to discuss how these ideas you feel like should or shouldn't be really centered in education across the board, not just education in religious context, but education broadly. Are we teaching these ideas explicitly, and should we be? So first questions for me, and then with whatever time we have to hear your discussion, application to your context, pushback would be great. Yeah, questions. Could be clarifying or probing questions.
I have a question. So I guess like maybe this is a probing question, speaking to what you were saying about like if there is somebody who has a dehumanizing interpretation of that sign, like who holds that understanding, where does it fit into this discussion of like there are spaces, like are there spaces where folks who would dehumanize you and you belong in the same room? Like for example, how like it's illegal for certain people in the US to be at the table with terrorists, whereas other countries don't hold that policy. So like nothing like in a classroom, but is there space within this to like, we started this whole conversation about breaking the echo chamber, and obviously there's a spectrum of breaking the echo chamber to a point where you're not being dehumanized by another person, and you wouldn't want to like put somebody in harm's way by putting two people in the same room together who don't humanize each other, or one who doesn't humanize the other. But where does that fit? Like, are you just saying that like you cannot engage with those extremes? Those are just like the scope is just not that broad and can't be, or does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. And I would say the goal is not to actually say not to engage. It's definitely not that. In many ways, it actually resonates exactly with your comment when we were talking about norms and the conditions for connecting across divides, which is, I would say that the space should be intentionally created to engage in dialogue, to seek to understand, whether that leads to shifting in views or just a deeper understanding of the humanity behind views you deeply oppose, and insight that could come from that. In doing that, though, you'd want to set the tone of the conversation in the way you described, which is, I want to hear what you have to say. I'm very curious about your views, and I respect your dignity as a human being, and I disagree, as opposed to a statement that says, here's something that's ambiguous, so you might think that I actually agree, or that the coalition I'm building on a values level creates space for people who have dehumanizing views, intentionally creates that space and says your voice will be amplified here. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. Yeah.
Sort of.
I think, yeah.
Alita, what were you going to say?
Well, I mean, it sort of makes sense. So in our conversation, I brought up, I'm from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and there is one conservative synagogue there, and there's one that's very liberal, interfaith, whatever. And then there's a bunch of smaller shuls that people go to. But outside of the conservative synagogue, every Saturday, there's a group of people that rest on the easement with signs that say boycott Israel. And so I don't necessarily think that having the sign support Israel would mean that that's somebody who holds a dehumanizing view of Palestinians, because I think that there's a lot more tension in that sign. And so I think what I'm struggling with in what you're talking about is, how do you, like, it's both sides of that are echo chambers.
Mm-hmm.
And if you make the assumption that the other echo chamber isn't going to listen, then you're automatically shutting things down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, and so taking it out of the context of the Israel-Palestine thing and thinking about how to do this in a classroom, sometimes I think, and maybe this is exactly what you were saying, and I just wasn't quite understanding, that you have to have those opposing views in order to get the conversation going and be able to hear what the other side thinks. But if you make the assumption that just because the sign is there, there is dehumanization, either sign or whatever, that then you're automatically shutting down the conversation. And so, like, I guess I'm trying to understand what the point about language usage has to do with creating a coalition, and how can you assume that everybody holds the same meaning of the words in that language when doing that? Because if they're not holding the same meaning, if they're only saying support Israel because they're going against the idea of just boycotting Israel or being anti-Semitic or being anti-Israel, then that's different than somebody who is a Zionist who wants to, like, do something that is oppressive. And I think navigating that is something that Jewish people have to do all the time. I'm half Jewish. I didn't say that in this thing, but yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think there's a really important aspect that I'd like to clarify, and it's really helping me to understand where to clarify, in that I completely agree with you that the sign "We Support Israel" does not inherently imply dehumanization in any way. It doesn't inherently imply that. What I'm saying in terms of pluralism and how you create space for pluralism in depolarized society is to get more specific. Because if you can get a little bit more specific when what you mean is not dehumanization, because it doesn't necessarily mean dehumanization by any means, when you can add that level of specificity, then the people who might be inclined to dehumanize and could feel like they can join your cause with that vague sign would then feel like, oh, that's actually not where I can stand shoulder to shoulder. And that might create the space for people who would be dehumanized to join in. So it's thinking about how specificity in framing it, and the same could be said for "We Stand with Palestine" or "We Support Palestine," right? It's the same logic there, and it's a question of how do you open the door to pluralism and in so doing depolarize society. And I appreciate what you're saying too, that in this context we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and these ideas aren't specific to that. And the fact that what I'm saying might come off as telling people, or in context of a classroom especially, young people to assume that when there's ambiguity, there's dehumanization. I really have to work on making sure that's not what I'm saying, making that clear. So thank you.
Right. Yeah, well, and I think even in some cases where somebody's views aren't ambiguous, maybe getting them to the table is even more important. Mm-hmm. So, like, somebody who is in favor of certain oppressive policies on any side of any conflict, prison or in the US or police brutality or Israel, Palestine, or any of these things that we all struggle with as moral agents, civic agents, that the people who have the extreme views are the ones who need to talk, and because they are the ones who are pushing an agenda. And so it's not just getting the people in the middle of the road to consider and shift, but also how do we shift the larger narrative? I don't know. Anyway, now I'm rambling.
No, it's really important points in terms of how to affect change. And yeah, at this point, just kind of open, because I know we only have like 3 minutes left. I want to respect that. But any comments to each other in the last few minutes, and I'll probably take like 30 seconds at the end just to wrap up.
Well, one thing we talked about in our breakout room was intent versus impact, and like the, you know, the intent of a sign like "We Stand with Israel" or any other sign that is a soundbite, like could be anything. The intent could be anything. But I think what I'm hearing from what you're presenting, Dave, is like if the impact could be dehumanization, then your words probably aren't doing. If you're not intending to dehumanize, then it's a problem with your word choice, and or the way that the whole movement has been shaped. But your words don't have to contribute to that. They can, but if you choose to specify, they don't have to.
And Thomas, I know you were about to say something before. I don't know if it's still on your mind.
Oh, no, I was just going to point out that Alita had wanted to talk and her mic hadn't been on the first time. So it was just to pull her in. Yeah, that was all.
Cool. All right. And I guess it is 2:39 right now. So I do just want to say thank you for being a part of this conversation, especially now. And I feel like especially now, what we're doing in this conversation itself is using distance learning, digital technology to actually bring conversations around pluralism to people. And if the second point there, that educational institutions should be designed around these ideas, one thing that I think is particularly relevant to the world right now is, can we channel what's going on with the need for these spaces to really bring these questions? And I don't claim to have all the right answers, but that these questions should be centered if we really want to depolarize society. And kind of the flip side of that is, what are the consequences of not explicitly teaching pluralism and allowing for polarization to continue when it comes to the functioning of a democracy? Like what are we doing to combat polarization, and how? For me, those questions are really front and center when it comes to what education needs to do and doesn't always do. And I feel like being in spaces like this with you all gives me insight into how to raise questions. And I feel like there's so many more questions to raise that we're not going to get into in 30 seconds. And just hearing your feedback right now raises questions for me in really important ways. So I just want to share my appreciation. And I'm happy to be in touch if anybody wants to continue a conversation. I didn't make a slide with my contact info, but Thomas, if there's a way to share info with participants, I can put it in the chat. Technology, speaking of, I'll just put it in the chat, and feel free to please reach out at any point. So I'm gonna put it in the chat right now. And then Thomas, I wanna leave you with anything that you'd like to add before we close too. Oh, you're on mute. Yeah.
Again, yeah. I would just say on behalf of CMEI, thank you, David, for being willing to roll with the punches of virtual reality and trying to make this work from a distance. And thanks to all of y'all for joining us. I think that this was an experiment. I think it worked really well, especially for this type of conversation, and try to tie it into this new pivot to distance learning, what that looks like with the world in which we now find ourselves existing in, and whatever we may find ourselves in the next few weeks. I will also add in the CMEI email address if any of you all ever want to join our mailing list or host your own grab bag lunch, let us know. We're trying to figure out more ways that we can try to keep CMEI conversations alive on the web throughout the rest of the semester, so the next 5 or 6 weeks. And we hope that people, again, like I said at the beginning, will be interested in doing that kind of stuff and just tuning in to see something less fun that's not class, but a chance to just see your peers and just a somewhat friendly knowledge sharing conversations for some of the stuff that we're definitely missing now, not being on campus. Tying into that, if you guys have thoughts on how this could be different things, if there's things that CMEI could look at and how to use Zoom in better ways, more effective ways, let me know that too. Again, I'm all open for learning new things, trying to figure things out. We want it to be the best experience that it can be. So yeah, many thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to close out, but yeah, please be in touch at any point. Go on.